Good morning, everybody, and welcome for day 2. It's so nice to see such a big crowd. We've missed this, and it's wonderful. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I get to introduce one of our very own members is going to speak for us this morning. Dr. Judy Whipps is a GVSU Professor Emerita of Integrative, Religious, and Intercultural Studies. She has published dozens of articles on women in the progressive era, capitalized, you'll understand why soon, and is currently working on a book about feminism and pragmatism in the 1920s and 30s. Now, Judy herself is a graduate of GVSU, and she received her PhD when she was 47, which, as we all know, having been there with kids and grands and all of that, that's quite an accomplishment. She wore several hats while teaching at GVSU, teaching in the liberal arts department, working with returning adult students, and also the accelerated leadership program. After retirement, she continues to write for professional journals, and I think this is her first year without teaching at all. So she now finds more time for her loves of gardening and traveling, and she's also a member of the Women's City Club and is a docent at Meyer Gardens. Judy's topic this morning is Frances Perkins and the woman behind the New Deal. In 1933, with the U.S. facing 25% unemployment, FDR appointed Frances Perkins as Secretary of Labor. She became the first woman to sit on a presidential cabinet, the first Madam Secretary, in quotes. Perkins' initiatives formed the basis of FDR's New Deal legislation and still affect us today. Social Security, unemployment insurance, child labor legislation, and minimum wage laws, things that we all take for granted. Her path to these historic accomplishments began at Jane Addams' Hull House, and her career developed through a strong community of reform-minded women who mentored and supported her. I don't know about you all, but I'm really looking forward to hearing about this woman in a lot more detail. So let's give a great grand form welcome to Judy.
So you all can hear me with this mic, right? So you are all my people. You're mostly retired from Grand Valley. We kind of share the same stage of life. As you heard, I was a faculty member and I was an alumni. So I went back to college and got my college degree at the age of 41. And so I have a real affinity for people, for lifelong learners. And you are all lifelong learners, right? So I always feel like this is what we should be doing, is continuing to learn throughout our lives. So Frances Perkins, did you know who she was? No. I'm embarrassed to say I heard her name, but I didn't know anything about her until my sister gave me her book. Her biography, because my sister is coming today. And I thought, this is what I should be looking at, because most of my work has been in the progressive era with Jane Addams and the women who were so important in the reform tradition, in the social reform tradition. And after 1920, people don't write about the women reformers after 1920, and we'll talk about why. And so I'm wondering what happened. And when I read about Frances Perkins, I knew this all continued and blossomed again with Perkins' life. So Frances Perkins broke a lot of glass ceilings. As the first woman to be in the presidential cabinet, she was the first woman in New York to be on an industrial commission that oversaw the industry. She was the first person to ever chair a committee like that in New York. And so it was hard to break a glass ceiling. We'll talk about all the struggles she had as a woman to do this kind of work. So we wonder, how was she able to do that? Like, what motivation did she have? What strengths did she draw on to be able to do that? So she knew FDR since 1910, and she started working with him in 1929 when he was a governor, and he put her in charge of the Industrial Commission in New York. So she had worked with him, she knew who he was. And so but FDR, everybody knows FDR, but he ran a campaign, and one of his campaign slogans was, "We need a New Deal." And people responded to that, so he kept saying it. But when he was elected in 1932, he didn't really have a plan for this New Deal. And so he had to gather his cabinet about him pretty quickly and start thinking, what do we do first? And I just turned it off, there it is. So, women had, like I said, nobody had ever been in cabinet before. And Frances Perkins was reluctant to take that job. The women were trying to encourage her to do that. And so, and then she knew that FDR was considering her. And when she got the call to come to the meeting with him, she wasn't sure if he was going to invite her. But she made a scribbled list. And she said, so she got to the meeting and she said to FDR, she took out her notes and said, "These are the initiatives that I want to work on, and I will not accept the position unless you're willing to support these initiatives." And this is the list that she brought. She wanted to address unemployment, child labor. This has been a 30-year thing, trying to get legislation to not allow children to work in factories. It's hard to imagine. But this is one thing she wanted to do. She wanted to push for the 8-hour workday. People were working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. The ones who were working, she wanted to create a program for workers' compensation. She wanted to create an unemployment insurance. Safety regulations in the workforce, this is something she had been involved in for a long time. And an old age pension, which is what we call Social Security. And she wanted to work for universal health insurance. FDR was on board for all of these except for, at first, but all of these except for the old age pension. He said, "You know that I don't support the dole." He really was opposed to just giving people money. And he said, if you want to do that, it has to not cost the government anything. But he agreed. So she wouldn't accept the position unless he agreed. And he agreed that he was willing to let her work on that. And in 6 years, all but the last one had been accomplished. And that's pretty remarkable that much change happened. So how did this career come about? That's what I was interested in. And like I said, she didn't really want to be on a cabinet. So how did this come about? This is FDR signing the bill into law. There's a little video of the staging of this photo, and she was off to the side. And somebody told her to come and stand behind FDR as the chief architect of the Social Security. And Perkins and FDR, like I said, they were friends. They knew each other since 1910. They didn't travel in the same social circles, but they knew each other's work. My talk kind of takes off from this book, which is probably the best book on Frances Perkins, and it says the woman behind the New Deal. I'm interested in the women behind the New Deal. So I'm going back to the genealogy of these women and how they created this. So I'm going to introduce you to 3 women, one of which I assume you've all heard. Jane Addams. I actually gave a talk here on Addams a couple of years ago before all the pandemic stuff happened. The next one is Florence Kelley, who was head of the National Consumers League and really Perkins' mentor. And the third one, you see Perkins standing next to Grace Abbott. And we'll talk briefly about Grace Abbott. So just try and keep those three women in mind as we talk about Frances Perkins. So just a bit about Hull House and Jane Addams. So Addams, at the age of 29, her father was an important person in Congress and in his community, but he died when she was just graduating from high school. And so she kind of was trying to find her way. She went to college, didn't know what to do, and she finally found her way. At age 29, she founded Hull House. So she moved into a house, a ramshackle house, in the district, in the industrial district of Chicago, where most people lived in tenements. It was an immigrant neighborhood. And she was able to rent the top floor of this house and eventually the full house. And eventually the owner of the house donated that to the Hull House. So the tenements in Chicago, this is how people lived. A lot of unemployment, a lot of just poverty. People got very low wages, lost their jobs. Men and women got injured in the job, and there was no compensation for that. They just weren't able to continue working. So this meatpacking district smelled really bad. In the summer, apparently it was really awful. So she moved into that neighborhood. She one time wanted to find the street, the actual pavement of the street, and she had to dig down through 8 inches of packed garbage to find the street. So some of these, it was really inhumane working conditions. In 1933, for example, 40% of children did not reach their 5th birthday. So children died frequently from disease and really just the care was unable to care for them quite often. And this is a neighborhood Addams moved into. And she really, Hull House was her home the rest of her life. In this neighborhood, there weren't a lot of schools. Children didn't usually go to school. Parents sent their kids to factories at age 5. And as you can see, they worked on machinery. This young boy is barefoot, and he's working on this dangerous piece of machinery. Mothers had no child care system. There was no backup relief system for any of these people. She talked about one woman who was concerned about the safety of her child, and so she tied her child to the kitchen table because she had to go to work to make enough money to feed them. And he got some disability from his leg didn't develop properly because he was tied by the leg to the kitchen table. And it's like you think, oh, that shouldn't have happened. It shouldn't have happened, but that woman had to work to provide food for others. And so Hull House became a very active community of reformers, mostly women, but men moved into Hull House as well. And this is Hull House in the early 1900s. Thousands of people came through Hull House every week. They had all kinds of activities and campaigns, and they had an art museum, they had a gymnasium, they established the first public baths. None of these tenements had baths. The toilet actually was usually down the street in another building. So they did all this, and they eventually grew to 13 buildings by the early 1900s and became a force for reform nationally and internationally. So Perkins, something that isn't usually mentioned, if it is, it's just kind of an aside. Yes, Perkins did live in Hull House from 1904 to 1907. And at that time, Addams was a national and international figure. She was known, she was on so many different groups and committees, and she'd be called for speaking engagements. And like I said, thousands of people in and out of Hull House. It just seems unlikely that she knew Perkins very well, or even it's possible she never even met her. Yet Addams continued to support Perkins' career throughout her life, and wrote letters of support for her, contacted letter writing campaigns for her. The other woman I want to talk about is Florence Kelley. So Florence Kelley showed up. she's a really interesting person. Yeah, I would like to have known Florence Kelley because she was this fiery advocate for the people. But she showed up at Hull House in 1891, fleeing domestic abuse. Her father had been a congressman. She moved to, and when her father was a congressman, he was interested in social reform, and because her mother had lost 5 of her 7 children to disease, wasn't really emotionally present for Florence Kelley, and so she was really close to her father. He took her when she was a child, and he was doing inspections of steel mills and glass factories. And she was just horrified that children, as you can see this small child on the second row, that children, young children, mostly boys, were in very dangerous jobs. They were kneeling by the furnaces of the glass factories. Actually, in the glass factories, they were called dogs. And they would do the work of making sure the fire was hot enough and bringing some of the glass to the glass blowers. So she saw all this, and she was horrified by it. So when she, came to Hull House, she, like I said, she had fled domestic abuse. She showed up at the door, knocked on the door, and she said she needed a job. She had lived in Europe, had become a Marxist communist, and she moved, and so was her husband, and when she moved back to New York, in Europe she had become, she had had a fight with her family over political things, and they really weren't supportive of her anymore. So she didn't have a lot of support. She had 3 children. She had to hide her children so that her husband didn't come and get them until she went through the court system to get custody. So she showed up and she said to Addams she needed a place to live, she needed an occupation, and she needed a way to hide her children. So Addams opened the door like with a baby in her hand and all this stuff going on around her. So Kelley, so Addams found a place for Kelley's kids and helped her find a job, because all the people at Hull House had to have occupations. So Florence Kelley was interested in industrial reform. She was horrified by people working in these sweatshops. She was horrified by child labor. And she used her background was in social science. She did a study of the neighborhood and made all these maps of the neighborhood, of the tenements. Like the black spots here are households that were making less than $5 a week. She used this data to start bringing people's consciousness to a new place in terms of the working conditions and living conditions of these people. She became Illinois' chief factory inspector, and but then she lost her job when there was a political turnover in the governor's office, and she eventually moved to New York, and she became first head of the National Consumers League. And the National Consumers League is kind of, they wanted, so she had this legislation against child labor and safe working conditions and 8-hour working hour passed in New York, but it was overturned not in Illinois, but it was overturned by the Illinois Supreme Court. And so she wasn't able to enforce any of that. So she took a different approach, and she said, we're going to appeal directly to consumers so people don't buy things that were produced in factories by children. It's kind of like fair trade coffee, that you want to buy things that are grown sustainably and ethically. And so they had a label that they could put on their clothes. This is the cartoon is the Supreme Court overturning minimum wage laws. The Supreme Court was not in favor of any things that interfered with commerce. They always voted in favor of commerce. Okay, so Frances Perkins. She was born Fanny Coralie Perkins. She changed her name to Frances at a point, because who wants to be in government with the name of Fanny? She got enough criticism as it was, just for being a woman. She went to Mount Holyoke. Her family was not wealthy, but they were middle class. They were able to send her to college. She went to Mount Holyoke. She was the class president. She's on the far end right here. She was skilled in leadership. And this is Mount Holyoke. So Frances, she was studying chemistry and physics. And then Florence Kelly came to Mount Holyoke and talked about child labor. This fiery talk that Perkins decided that's what she was going to do with her life. So after she graduated, she went to New York and went to a social service agency and said, I want to work here. The guy in charge said, well, what would you do if this or this happened? And she said, I'd call the police. And he said, that's not the right answer. She needed more background to be able to work in social services. So the only job she was able to get was teaching. And she taught for a time in Boston where she grew up. She saw a job opening in Chicago, and she moved there so she could be closer to Hull House. And she started volunteering at Hull House. She had to live at the college, at the school where she was teaching. It wasn't college. At the school she was teaching. But she would spend her weekends at Hull House and her summers at Hull House. This is the residence hall at Hull House, so you can see about the same time that she was there. Jane Addams is over here. But anyway, so she wrote that Hull House was her true family. She had reconciled with her family by this time as well, but she said that, no, that was Kelly who reconciled with her family. But people who lived at Hull House had to pay room and board, and she had to have a career. Her family didn't have that kind of money to support her. Some of the women's families did support them while they were living at Hull House. So what is she going to do? She decided that teaching wasn't really her profession, so she wanted to find a way to actually work in the community. And she got a job as a general secretary of the Philadelphia Research and Protective Association. And she did research on prostitution and poverty. That meant that she visited bordellos. She worked mostly with sex trafficking of young women. She confronted pimps. She was out in the street in this neighborhood as a woman who grew up fairly protected, and she was out there pretty much alone on the streets trying to gather data and talk to the women and try and figure out how they can address some of these issues. She did start taking classes at the Wharton School at the University of Chicago, Pennsylvania. And after a couple of years, she got a fellowship to go to Columbia. She did research on child nutrition in Hell's Kitchen. And as you can tell by the name, Hell's Kitchen was not a place that people really wanted to live. But she lived in Greenwich Village. She loved the artistic community, and she really felt at home there. She loved going to school. She loved the artists and the social workers, and she really enjoyed that work. So in 1911, who's heard of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire? Yeah. In 1911, she was at a friend's house having coffee, and the person's house she was at was in the same square as the building that held the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. They heard all these sirens and rushed out and saw that the building was on fire. So she was standing there watching watching people die, really. The factory was on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors. And A lot of times in these factories, they lock the door. That was pretty standard practice, to lock the door so that sometimes because they were worried about theft, they didn't want the employees to go out for unscheduled break. But that made it really unsafe for people. There were other fires that this happened too. But about 500 people were working in the factory when this fire broke out. So many of these people could not get out. So 146 people died in this factory. So here's the kind of sweatshop conditions. This is the Triangle factory before the fire, and what it looked like after the fire. So I'm going to read you what Frances Perkins said about this. She said, one by one, what happened was people started jumping out of the windows because the fire was right on their back, and they knew they couldn't get out. And she said, and so she saw people jumping, and she said, one by one, these people are hanging, some of them hanging on windowsills, people would fall off. They couldn't hold on any longer. The grip gives way. There began to be panic jumping. People who had their clothes on fire would jump. It was a most horrid spectacle. Even when they got the nets up, so the firemen put up nets, the nets did not hold in a jump from that height. There was no place to go. The fire was between them and any means of exit. They had gone to the window for air when the smoke started, and their only choice was to go out that window. They did have a fire ladder, the firemen did, but it only went up to the 6th floor. So they really had no escape. She said, one woman walked deliberately to the edge, removed her wide brim hat and threw it in the air. Then she opened her handbag, extracted the few coins and bills that made up her pay, flung them to the ground. As the coins rang on the cobblestones, she jumped. So, like I said, she saw 146 people die. Not all of them jumped, but a lot of them did. So not all of them were women, but they were mostly women between the ages of 14 and 23. So they were mostly Italian immigrants or Jewish immigrants. The oldest victim was 43, and the youngest were 2 14-year-old girls. So that would be quite something to witness. It would just be horrible. So Perkins, after seeing that, decided to dedicate her life to labor safety. So 2 years before this, the women who worked at Triangle had engaged in a mass protest. And they were out in the streets trying to get better working conditions. The police intervened, threw them in jail. The strikers had no recourse, and they all went back to work with no concessions for safety. So this is one of the newspaper articles at the time, the bodies of some of the young women. And so she just dedicated the next 20 years of her life to industrial safety in a progressively more responsible position. So when she started to go to meetings on safety, started to do reports on it, she was asked to be on a citizens committee for the safety of New York. When that committee was created, they were hoping Teddy Roosevelt would chair it. And when they went to ask him, he said, the person for the job is Frances Perkins. So, and why did he say that? Well, Jane Addams had written to him, and Florence Kelley had written to him saying, Perkins should be the one for this position. She should be on this board. So, and he knew Perkins, he knew of her work as head of the New York Consumers League. So she was on this citizens committee. The citizens committee recommended a legislative committee for to investigate the conditions. And she became first the investigator and then the primary investigator for New York. And then she got a call from the governor, and he wanted her to join the New York State Industrial Commission. This was an oversight commission. There had never been a woman on this committee. And so she wasn't sure because she was part of the social reform movement. So she said she had to talk to someone before she accepted. She went and found Florence Kelley at a train station and told her about the offer. And she was, because she was like, I want to work in social reform, and now I'm jumping into politics, the political world. Florence Kelley said, I never thought I'd live to see the day. Oh, Florence Kelley burst into tears, actually. It was like, it's hard to imagine Florence Kelley crying. She was such a tough. But she burst into tears and said, I never thought I'd live to see the day when someone we had trained and who knew industrial conditions and cared about women would have the chance to become an administrative officer. A lot of these positions were given to political cronies, and they were appointments to reward people who worked on campaigns. So to have a woman who knew industrial conditions. So this allowed Perkins to become really integral to the whole safety issue. And then in 1929, she was appointed the New York State Industrial Commissioner, so she was put in charge. And people were so angry. Her job was like $8,000 a year, that position, and they did not think that a woman should make that kind of money. And people said, I never worked for a woman, but she did good. And then in 1929, when FDR took over as New York State governor, he made sure that she stayed as head of the commissioner, as head commissioner in the department. And Kelly wrote to her and said that because of her appointment, she wrote and said, there will be less death, misery, and poverty because you are at the helm. And Perkins wrote back to her and said, to the very last ounce of my ability, I shall try and do what you expect of me. So again, that she was motivated by these relationships that she had with these women. In the meantime, Perkins married. So she married in 1913. She had a daughter in 1916, her daughter Susanna, her only daughter. Her husband, Paul, had some family money, and she stopped working for 2 years after her daughter was born. And she, by all accounts, loved being a mother. She loved her little girl, loved playing with her hair and dressing her, and wanted her little girl to have the best possible life. Paul, though, who had a good job, started acting erratically, and he had what we might now call bipolar or manic depressive disorder, and it was pretty severe. He lost his job and had to be hospitalized. And so that left Perkins as the main breadwinner in the family. So she had to pay for Paul's stay in the hospital, in the home where he lived. She had to help raise her child. She had to raise her child. She became the primary parent as well. But she had to go to work. And so that's when she went back to working on the Industrial Committee. So when FDR was elected president in 1932, the Hull House Network, they had a whole national network of women's organizations, women's city clubs, that were responsive to the requests that they sent out. So Hull House, Jane Addams and the women at Hull sent out notices to all of the clubs in the network that they were part of, saying, write to FDR and tell him we want Frances Perkins as Secretary of Labor. And the network of the National Consumers League did the same. So he had all of these letters coming to him. And Perkins was like, I'm not sure that I want this job. I want to stay here. She had a really close group of supporters in New York. But they just went ahead with their campaign. And at one point, one of her friends said, don't be a baby, Perkins. You need to take this job. And then that didn't quite work. So her friend said, who was also a friend of Florence Kelley, said, this is what Florence Kelley would want you to do. And Florence Kelley had just died that same year. And that convinced her. She said, she recalled Florence Kelley looking at her saying, Frances, you've got to do it. And that meant that I did. So she decided that if FDR would support the initiatives that she wanted to work on, that she would accept if he told her. So when she met with him, he agreed to that list of initiatives. And she, that night, went home and was sobbing. She spent the night crying. She really didn't know Washington. She didn't want to leave her friends and her family. She had to still take care of Paul in Massville. And her daughter was in, and she had 2 more years of high school. But because she felt this duty, she was really motivated by a strong sense of duty. So, in other things, Grace Abbott, who we'll just briefly touch about, she did all kinds of things to also support the nomination. She was right then the most influential woman in Washington. She was head of the Children's Bureau. She set up meetings with Perkins, with legislators. She had Perkins as a conference speaker and invited all the women reporters and arranged for publicity shots so that Perkins' name was out in the news. So she agreed to accept the position. She knew it would be really tough. Being the first woman in a position like this, she knew she would be a target. And she knew it would really be a struggle. So, I'm going to just see if this works. Just 2 minutes.
In the fall of 1932, the grand democratic experiment was failing, as America was in free fall through the Great Depression, and there were more people leaving the country than arriving. Then, in November, the American people petitioned Franklin Delano Roosevelt to reorient the role of government by invoking the constitutional promise to promote the general welfare.
Can you hear that?
No. But he didn't do it alone. Only a dozen years after women gained the right to vote, Roosevelt nominated the first woman to serve in a presidential cabinet. Together, they would weave a social safety net that would bring about a profound change in the way that Americans live their lives.
Frances Perkins paved the way and made it easier for the rest of us.
She inherited part of the tradition of service. She was its caretaker for a little while, and she passed it on to another generation.
In the moment in time in which she was operating, she was just an unusual figure, unusually committed, unusually brave, alone in a world full of men.
There was a timelessness and a transcendence to the quality of her work, because it was not something she was ever going to complete herself, just a natural part of the fabric of American society right now.
There is no contribution that a cabinet member has made in the history of this country that has had the lasting kind of effect on all of us and the way we live than what Frances Perkins did.
Poverty is tough, misery is difficult, pain and suffering are hard, but nothing equals the loss of self-esteem in a person's life. Frances Perkins changed that.
As I said, this appointment really happened in the power of women behind the appointment. Although she knew FDR, he knew her, so there was that. Any questions at this point? Yeah, go ahead.
At least one of those women had a daughter. Was there advocacy among the next generation of their families? Like Susanna Perkins, for example. Were they advocates?
In many ways, but Susanna Perkins was, she also had psychiatric problems. So she was fine until her second year of college, and she had a nervous breakdown. And so, so Perkins also had to deal with that. She eventually did go back to school. She never graduated, but she did eventually get married, and she went marriage. So Susanna was not an emotionally healthy person. So she wouldn't have been, but certainly they inspired the next generation. They were always looking forward. You know, just like Perkins was the next generation after Addams, they were looking forward to the next generation as well. Yes, yeah.
How would you define settlement house? Do we have a settlement type thing now?
No. Well, we have Hull House as an organization continues. So at that time, there were no charitable organizations. There was, you know, if you lost your job and your children could starve. So the settlement houses were women, generally of middle and upper class, that would move into the neighborhood and advocate for these people and do fundraising to provide services for them. Like Hull House started a child care center. They became very involved politically, trying to change the conditions. But today, things are a lot different. We have a lot of social support networks, and so the settlement houses there are still people who decide to go live in the neighborhoods that need the help, but not in the same way as settlement houses. Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to make a comment. As a social worker, if you go into, social work, you do a lot of study of Jane Addams, and she is credited as being like the first modern day social worker.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
She's considered the creator of social work. She's also considered one of the first sociologists. And of course, she got the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931. She was a nationally known and beloved person until after World War II. We can talk about that sometime, but yes. Anybody else? Thank you. Yeah.
So she's joining the men's club. What kind of strategies and tricks did she employ to fit in? I saw her laughing with somebody that was next to FDR, making him laugh. And she seemed to be, she must have used some kind of tricks to employ her.
Can you repeat the question so that
Sure. So he asked me, what gets at that? But how did she handle being a woman in a position that really was designed for men? And Perkins always studied the men she worked for and tried to figure out how they wanted to work. But when she got to Washington, she didn't know anybody. She barely made it to the inauguration. She didn't have a car to pick her up. She just thought she could get a taxi. After FDR wanted everyone to go to church with him that morning, and after church, all the cabinet members took off in their private cars that would pick them up, the drivers. And she tried to get a taxi, couldn't, had to run to the inauguration, ran across the White House lawn. Then they didn't want to let her in to the platform. They didn't know who she was. She barely got into her seat before the inauguration started. So those are some of the things. And once she started working, they said, we don't even know what to call you. They would call cabinet members usually honorable this or that. So what do we call a woman? And somebody suggested Madam. And so now she became Madam Secretary. Other people played with that, called it a Madame. Yeah. So I can answer this question right now. So what did she do? She decided she would be as inconspicuous as possible. So you see her kind of in the corner here, And almost all pictures, except for the one of FDR signing Social Security, she's at the edge. She lowered her skirts and dresses by 2 inches. She wanted to appear motherly and not a threat to men or their wives or their mothers. So she had to negotiate that. She didn't know Washington procedures at all. She's like, where does a woman sit in official functions? She decided that she should sit with the wives instead of in the cabinet, with the cabinet members. The other thing that so she went to her first cabinet meeting, and she wrote in her journal, I tried to have as much of a mask as possible. I wanted to give the impression of a quiet, orderly woman who didn't buzz all the time, who didn't try to butt in where she wasn't wanted. I kept perfectly still. I knew that a lady interposing an idea into men's conversation was very unwelcome. So she stayed in the background, but she became the worker bee, really, for FDR. She would present reports or present ideas when she was called on.
Did she have a friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt?
It's a really good question. I've been thinking about that a lot this week, and what it tells us about Eleanor and about Frances Perkins. She knew Eleanor, and she would call on Eleanor for help in particular situations to intercede with FDR, but they were not close. Eleanor really, and FDR really had their own worlds and their own thing. They would come together, but they had their own things going on, and Frances was part of FDR's world. So yeah, and Eleanor was more of an idealist than Perkins. Like she wanted to, like she started Arthurdale, she went to a community that was really poor, and she's like, I'm going to raise this community up. She invested her own money into building houses. Perkins would have taken an administrative, she would work on the social systems that created a condition that these people were in. So yes, they knew each other. Perkins was probably more pragmatic than Roosevelt, and than Eleanor. I think that's such an interesting question because it tells us so much about it. So there she is in a role designed for men. So they still had the tradition of the women would, after an important meal, after a meal, the women would retire to the parlor. The men would go to another room and smoke and talk. And they generally, like they were cabinet people, would do business. The men would do business when they went to their side of the house. And Perkins knew they were doing business. Where did she go? She went and with the women. And she got to know the wives and the mothers of all the politicians. And strangely, once she started working for FDR, she changed her birth date so that she was 2 years younger. And most people don't, what in the world is that about? Because she was not she didn't want to present herself as a feminine beauty or anything. But some people think it's because she didn't want to be 2 years older than FDR. She didn't want to present herself, so that she was in a position any more advanced than he was. So it had relevant, had implications later when people tried to find her birth certificate. She changed her birth date. So, so another thing about Washington is it was a southern city, and they followed procedures like a southern city, the social procedures. Perkins had to actually, she was a wife and a mother and a professional, and how does that all work? So she was, it was kind of expected that you'd have people to your house for dinner, and all of his social obligations, that cabinet members' wives were expected to handle for their spouses. She didn't have that. And she couldn't afford a big house. She was paying for actually her house in New York, her husband in the care, her daughter's growing up expenses. She couldn't afford to get a big house. And Harriet Rumsey, a friend of hers from New York, moved to Washington and set up and she was very wealthy, and she set up a household, and she became the social support for Perkins. And so she arranged all the parties. She arranged, there was an article in the Washington Press saying, where do people live? Where do people drop off a calling card? That's what women did. They would come and drop off a calling card indicating they wanted to visit and socialize. And there was no place. They said, should people bring it to her office? So anyway, Mary Harriet Rumsey became a lifesaver for her, but and Rumsey was a wonderful woman. Everybody loved her. She started the Junior League, and she was very involved in social reform. But 2 years after she moved to Washington, she fell off a horse and died. And so it was tragic for Perkins. It was her closest, really support person at the time. And Perkins eventually lived with another woman in her house who at least allowed her to live at the standards that was expected of a cabinet member. So the New Deal, I need to get to this, don't I? So FDR comes into office. His first idea, and this was his idea, he wanted to create a civilian conservation corps. And he said, I see all these lines, the red lines. We should take all of those people, bring them into the forest, and they could work, and then we could give them money. We could hire them. And he called Perkins and said, I want you to handle this. She said, a lot of these people are really not physically able to do planting and digging kind of work. And he said, well, just make it happen. And she said, where am I going to find these people? He said, use your employment agency. She said, I don't have an employment agency. And he said, well, create one then. So then she decided to call on the Secretary of the Interior and the head of the War Department, and they organized the Civilian Conservation Corps, kind of like an army, and it employed men between 18 and 23 to work in factories and work in the fields. So Perkins. So Social Security was one of her goals. And FDR had said he would support it. So in his second year of presidency, he called her in, and she'd been very busy. The Labor Department was just a mess when she took over. There was a lot of corruption. The mafia had become part of the Labor Department. The guy, when she took over, he didn't even intend on leaving. She had to show up. He never called her. She showed up, and she said he was just working in it. He was just in his office. He didn't plan on leaving. So she went in. She wanted to have a conference with him. And then she said, don't you have a luncheon appointment? He said, yes. And she said, great. We'll pack up your office while you're at lunch. So she got the staff to pack up this guy's office, and he came back and she said, where shall we send your stuff? And she had to do that to start the Labor Department. Okay. So, in 1934, FDR said, okay, now's the time. You put Perkins in charge of the committee, a cabinet committee. He created an outside committee of citizens that would actually help them. And they started working to create a Social Security plan. So they did this, they gathered all the evidence, all the reports, how things were done in other countries. And finally, she called the cabinet committee together into a room in her house. She set a whiskey decanter on the table. She locked the door and said, "We are finishing this today. We're not going home until it's done." And they wrote the Social Security plan. And so it was a team effort. Grace Abbott had been part of early stages and written part of it. They incorporated that into their bill. And the next day she went to FDR. She said, "This is a plan." FDR accepted it. They decided Wagner was a congressman who was going to introduce it to Congress, and then it was introduced to Congress. It's just, that's the kind of person she was. This is not an Eleanor Roosevelt kind of person necessarily. You know, you can imagine she was tough and political at this point, and she had to get it done. So in the Social Security, it was introduced in January. The Congress made some changes to it, but it showed up in FDR's office in August. He signed it into law. When FDR agreed to do this, you know, he had told Frances Perkins, "This cannot cost the government any money." He didn't even give the money for the committee to do the work. And one of the other people that was on the committee pulled some money out of their coffers to create this. So it started, and she did that, of course, with the insurance plan that we all know now. It hasn't changed very much since the time that she wrote that. So when people say FDR created Social Security, yes, I mean, he wouldn't have done it without Perkins. But today we probably wouldn't have Social Security in the form it's in. We might have found something how to do something like that. But she had told FDR, it's now, or it's not going to happen for 25 years. It needs to get done. So the Social Security went into law on August 14, 1935. Her next initiative was the Fair Labor Standards Act, and she and FDR talked a lot. So she started working for this earlier, but he didn't want to introduce it, he didn't want to create it until right before the election, so he was a very political person. But they did finally create, and she wrote most of it, the Fair Labor Standards Act, which passed in 1938, and that gave the world the 40-hour work week, the first federal minimum wage law at 40 cents an hour. It prohibited child labor under 16, and between 16 and 18, they could not work during school hours. So this freed all the children to go to school, and it created workplace safety, what we now know as OSHA. So this passed, and this is another, so really this was the accomplishment that Jane Addams, Florence Kelley, all of these women before her, this is what they tried to pass for, and did pass, but the Supreme Court just kept overturning any legislation that impacted commerce. But by this time, there was a slightly different Supreme Court. And as we know, the makeup of a Supreme Court can make a big difference. Unfortunately, sometimes. So, again, so 1938, immigration and the Nazi threat. The Immigration Bureau was in the Department of Labor. So Frances Perkins was in charge of immigration. The people had to get visas from the consulates in the countries that they lived in, but the Immigration Bureau decided who could come and who got kicked out. So they were in charge of enforcing immigration law. But once Perkins started hearing stories about immigration, about the Nazis and what was happening to Jewish people, disabled people, and people in labor unions, she started advocating and trying to stretch the law to give more, to enable more of these people and more children to come to the U.S. as immigrants. She got, but she had to work within the law. She couldn't do, and Congress passed a law restricting immigration to a quota system. And the quota system was we couldn't, the current makeup of the country, like the percentage of the country that was German, they could only have that percentage of the immigration quota. So it reflected the population. So she stretched the law in as many ways as she could. People who were here on travel visas, she got FDR to say it was okay, that they didn't have to go back. This is a letter that somebody wrote to a consulate saying, FDR said that my wife could stay because she's on a travel visa, a tourist visa, basically. But people were so angry about immigration in this time period and so suspicious and really anti-Semitic. So they didn't want Jews to come into the US. And even though, I mean, we didn't know the extent of the Holocaust, but the Secretary of State really fought Perkins on everything that she did and all the different ways that she tried to stretch the immigration law to allow refugees to travel here. And FDR supported her in some of this, but not publicly. So he would not criticize the immigration law. And because he needed the Southern Democrats who were, well, they were still, a lot of them influenced by the Ku Klux Klan and pretty racist. But also the Secretary of State was really pushed back on Perkins for this. But she kept working on it. She never gave up until, so she knew what Kristallnacht, I probably don't say that well, but that's the night that Germans went around and started killing people, yeah.
I wonder if any of this will be mentioned in the new Ken Burns documentary coming out on PBS about the Holocaust. I'm interested to see that.
Yeah, me too. I hope she shows up.
Question?
Yeah.
No, what he said.
Oh, I'm sorry. He asked if this would be in the new Ken Burns documentary on the Holocaust, the American response to the Holocaust. I would imagine. But Ken Burns' documentary, the whole series on the Roosevelts, when they got to Social Security, they said, yeah, Social Security, it was introduced by Senator Wagner. Well, it was, but she wrote it. But she was okay with staying in the background. Yeah, did that answer? Yeah. I will be interested to see that. It seems like it's got to be the work that she did. And the Holocaust Museum has a thing on Perkins about the work that she did. I mean, she is acknowledged as working hard to get children, to get the immigrants out of Germany. And she fought against a lot of public sentiment and fury about immigration, which, yeah, so in 1939, a person, and I need to wrap this up so we can do more questions, but in 1939, a person who was an immigrant from Australia was involved in a labor strike in San Francisco. And the people who were in charge of the factories wanted impeachment procedures against this person. They accused him of being a communist. And at that time, it was not illegal to be a communist, but if you were not a citizen, you were deported if you were a communist. So they wanted her office, the Immigration Bureau, to deport this guy Bridges. And this was just the focal point for all of this anti-immigration stuff. And Perkins her office did an investigation on it, but she said she didn't see any evidence that this guy was a communist. He said he accepted some funds from communist organizations, but that he wasn't a communist and the labor movement wasn't a communist. So this went into the media, the way the social media is today. It was kind of like that. She was accused of being a Jew herself, and she was accused of having a sexual relationship with this guy, Bridges. He was in San Francisco. People said that she was not born in the U.S., that she had lied about her birth. She had to, this is like the birther movement, right? She had to produce her birth certificate. But people said that they found a Frances Perkins living in New Mexico, who, that must be her, who really wasn't born in the U.S. She produced her family lineage. But people said she was actually this Jewish person named Matilda Worski. And so this was all in the newspapers, and she was being impeached. And so she said, if I were Jewish, I would make no secret of it. On the contrary, I would be proud to acknowledge it. So she was doing all of this, proving her lineage while saying this shouldn't be happening. During the impeachment, nobody in Congress or the cabinet stood up for her defense. FDR said nothing. When he was asked about it in press conferences, he said he wouldn't talk about it. When she met with him, she had already talked to him about the Bridges thing, and he thought she was doing the right thing. But he didn't support her. And so it was just a very hard time for her to deal with all this media controversy and to not. She knew FDR supported her, but he just didn't take it seriously, and he didn't want to speak out for fear of political reasons. And so it was in a congressional meeting, and she had to answer all these questions. They never actually got to the full floor. It was finally dismissed. But at that time, Perkins started visiting a convent. So she would spend her weekends and as much free time as she had in the convent. She was quite religious. She was Episcopalian. And so she would spend time in meditation and prayer trying to deal with this. Again, this was a really hard choice she made. And her daughter wasn't well. Her husband escaped from the asylum where he was living, and she had to rush back to New York and try to locate him. There were all this stuff, and then this impeachment proceeding. So after 1940, after all of this, she wanted to resign, and she wrote FDR with a letter of resignation. She just never heard back from him, so she called Eleanor Roosevelt and said, can you help me with this? So Eleanor went to FDR and said, Frances Perkins wants to resign. And he finally said, no, I need her. She's got to stay. And so she had such a sense of duty, so she stayed in his cabinet until his death. She was the longest serving, one of the longest serving cabinet secretaries that's been in the United States. She was in the cabinet for over 15 years, for about 15 years. So, but then FDR died in his fourth term, a couple years into his fourth term. And Truman took over. This is the day of FDR's death. Of course, they had to swear Truman in immediately. You can see the cabinet officers looking pretty somber that FDR had suddenly died. And Truman checked around with people in his staff and said he didn't think that men could talk freely with a woman present. So when she submitted her resignation, and several months later, Truman accepted her resignation. Yeah.
Is that her on the far left?
Yeah.
Right, looking down? Okay.
Yeah. You can see she's struggling. Again, FDR was part of her life. They were very close for many years. And so she stayed another 3 months. She eventually was able to resign and went back to New York. So Truman appointed her to the Civil Service Commission. She was approached by a publisher wanting her to write a biography of Roosevelt. And she said she couldn't afford it. She couldn't afford to take the time off work to write a biography of Perkins. And they said, well, just talk into a microphone, record it, and we'll work on transcribing it, which is what happened. So her biography of FDR called Roosevelt I Knew became a bestseller. She started working at Cornell University as a visiting professor, which she did for the last 10 years of her life. Her daughter, Susanna, had been divorced, but eventually remarried and had a child. And so she would go back and forth to New York to see her grandson. And she died in New York City in a hospital, and she was buried in Maine. So, what do you think? Isn't she an amazing woman? It's like, wow, she really changed the fabric of our lives. Questions, other questions about Perkins?
We're going to have a mic. I'll pass the handheld mic around so people can hear the question.
Good idea. I always struggle with that myself in an audience.
No, I know.
If you don't think of it as you.
I know.
Questions? Come on, you guys. This is why we enjoy being together, because of the question and answer. Now look what happened.
Well, people ask questions during it, which is good.
Well, this is just more of a comment, but I had no idea that she, really orchestrated and helped Social Security. And now that we are all at that age,
Yes.
we realize how thankful we should be to her for all she did.
Yes.
Yeah.
Really. Yeah.
In one of the first couple of slides, there was a photo up there of a book called The Woman Behind the New Deal by Kristen Downey.
Yes.
Assuming you would recommend that?
Yes.
And are there any other books that might be interesting for us?
There are two biographies of Frances Perkins. I think Kristen Downey's is the best, the film, the one that we saw. There's a wonderful documentary on Perkins. It's, I think, on Netflix still. It's called Summoned.
What's it called? Summoned.
So it's a 1-hour documentary, and it really talks about a lot of the same issues. The other biography of Perkins by George Martin, he wrote it, I think, in the 1960s, and he was able to interview a lot of the people that knew Perkins. But there's also, she did oral histories that are, I just got the microphones of her oral histories. So there's a lot of resources, but not enough that people know about her. There is now the Frances Perkins building. This is where the Department of Labor is housed. And just this summer, or just in March, New York City honored Perkins as the mother of Social Security by naming a street. So people are starting to recover the women in our history. They just somehow get left aside.
Judy, we probably all heard the saying, the times make the man, or do the men make the times? In the case of Frances Perkins, how would you answer that? Do you think there's a difference between men and women and how you answer that? Because she seemed remarkably courageous, even though you shared some of her internal turmoil at different stages.
Yeah. Well, certainly the times made Frances Perkins. I think she would have wanted to be a professional and worked in social service work, but she was kind of pushed into this position. She's the person that everybody put their energy on to move a woman into a cabinet office to bring some of these social reforms into practice. So is it different for a man and a woman? Certainly. It's like how she can do that work and maintain the social responsibilities of a woman. this is a struggle that women still face. You know, they try to deal with mothering and planning for a family and running a professional career as well. So, yeah. Great.
Did she have contact with people who were working on similar issues in other countries, especially England, going through many similar difficulties and processes of child labor? So did she have contact with people in other countries, taking advice and exchanging views?
Yes, she certainly did. There's a new biography. It was self-published by a person who in Britain, and it really looks at the international work that she did. But they looked at other countries that had Social Security type plans, you know, to try and learn from them, what they did. She got the U.S. into the International Labor Organization, which was in Geneva. She did work internationally. And how she did all this work, who knows? Yeah, she was like fighting for an 8-hour workday, and she was working 14 hours a day. You know, and then when she retired, Social Security didn't give her enough money to support herself. So she had a lot of challenges in her life that men didn't have. Yeah.
Is there a Frances Perkins living today?
Well, I think there's a lot of Frances Perkins living today in terms of people like her who are modeling.
Yeah, but can you give us some names?
I think that that would really show my political leanings. I'm not sure how much you want that. But, yeah.
You've talked a lot about how she had to deal with family responsibilities, but do you know how she actually dealt with the child care? I mean, women today have options, but obviously this was brand new territory when Frances Perkins was dealing with it. How did she deal with child care for her daughter?
Yes. So there was no child care. She relied on friends. So I don't know when her daughter was very young what happened, but as her daughter was growing up, yeah.
She took 2 years off.
She took 2 years off from work. So I don't know when her daughter would have been like 3 or 4, what she did, and I didn't find that in any biographies. But as she was growing up, she relied on friends. Mary Rumsey, who moved to Washington, had lived in New York, and Susanna called her second mother because she had a daughter about Susanna's age, and she spent a lot of time there when Perkins was tied up in her work. So friends, I think you can't raise a child without community support. It's so much part of the community. And so without those social supports, they really prevent a lot of women from working.
Well, I'll ask a question. It jumped out at me on her list of goals that the last one was never accomplished. Universal health care. Do you think there's any chance that it ever will be, or is there any hope for that? Or is it a dead issue?
I mean, we do have the Affordable Care Act. So there are some movements towards that. The healthcare system seems a little broken. But yes, she knew. She said off this list, and she tried. She tried to get bills into Congress and get them passed, but people were so opposed to any kind of social networks, social support networks like that. And she mourned the fact that she never accomplished universal health coverage. That was something and it was something that the women of the progressive era, which was when a lot of these reforms were being experimented with, were also advocating for, but it never happened. And how many years has it been since 1935? It's a lot. And it was another 40 years before there was a woman as Secretary of Labor. So she broke these glass ceilings. 40 years, until there was a woman Secretary of Labor. In 1950, there was for a very short time a woman on the cabinet, and Jerry Ford brought a woman on the cabinet when he was president, and that really, from there on, there were women in cabinet. So, yeah, it was a long haul. And will we ever have a woman president? Yeah. I mean, we still, with limitations on reproductive freedom, women are even more restricted in some ways of what they can do professionally if they can't control that. There's a little bit of my politics right there.
I'm curious how old Frances Perkins was when she changed her age. I have a reason for asking this question.
I'm not exactly sure. I think that she was in her early 30s when she started lying about her age. Yes.
No, I was curious because my mother, when she went to work in her late 30s, changed her age by 6 years. She was told that if you're that age, they're not going to want you because you're going to go into menopause and be difficult. She changed her age, and it was quite something when she wanted to retire because everybody thought she was 59 and she was 65.
That's hilarious. I would like to meet your mother. That's amazing. But women had to manipulate these things all the time to try and figure out how they could get into these positions. Some women of a particular age didn't get jobs because people thought they'd get pregnant. And it's all of that. Perkins had to fight all that because she had to support herself. She had to support her daughter, and she had to support her husband.
My partner said when his father died, before his mother did, they had grave sites, and she put her birth date on her gravestone at that point because she never wanted to be known that she was older than his father. So it was engraved in stone at that point.
Well, like I said, she didn't want to be older than FDR. And so he was her main boss. And so, yeah, it's the same kind of thing with marriage. You don't want to be older than your husband. That society has those expectations. But it's pretty funny, really, But Perkins also had to petition the court after she got married to keep her maiden name. So she had to go to court to be able to be Frances Perkins rather than Frances Wilson, which was her husband's name. So I'm introducing this woman into your lives. I feel like when I study these women, they become part of, my life. They're like people in my life, And they become inspirations, and it fills out my sense of history, of really what this country did and how the women were so integral in it. And for me, it's really fun to explore these things. I hope it was fun for you guys too.